Live from Darshan Studios, it's Zinc Comics Exposition with Brian Payne. Good evening. This week we're shining the spotlight on a truly amazing hero, Cerebus, and specifically on the artist Dave Sim. There's an interview in here with Dave Sim, and in it, he talks about self-publishing, which he is one of the pioneers of, and one of the most successful stories related to the self-publishing movement. And I remember buying his self-publishing guide, and it had a lot of interesting and useful hints. It began as a series of editorials in his book, and then it became a book of itself. In the comic, it began on the inside of Cerebus, the comic book, but it ended up becoming a book of itself. And I think he's done an updated version as well. Some of the stuff's obsolete nowadays with technology, but it's still a good read and has a lot of useful and important information. One thing he's talking about is he's getting ready to go on tour. I'm guessing in 92. Not sure if this is the Spirits of Independence tour or, but I believe so. He's doing Mothers and Daughters at this time, so I would assume that that is the case. But he's talking about how he wants to help promote other self-publishers. And he says that these are people who don't get mentioned that often in the fan press, since most of the field just talks about Marvel and DC. A lot of my point here is to maybe change that dialogue a bit. And then he's talking about the direct market and comic book stores, and he talks about how it seems obvious that stores would want to attract more adults to read comics. Nowadays, it might be the reverse, since we need to hook a new generation on the comic book. But at that time, we were still trying to get our legitimacy and continue to at this point. But Sim talks about how it would be obvious that if you could have a store with books like Cerebus, Love and Rockets, Yummy Fur, ElfQuest, Mouse, and sold them next to books like Doonesbury, Calvin and Hobbes, The Far Side, and Garfield, that you would attract new and older readers. And that most older readers know Doonesbury already. And if you put something like Sandman next to it, they might be apt to pick it up and say, "What's this?" So I think those are good points, and they still seem relevant to me. And he makes a point of saying, I have no objection to somebody who is selling a ton of Marvel comics, but he wants them to carry other things as well. And he says that we independent publishers have to take a certain amount of satisfaction that there are stores which have the same attitude as us. And more we need those stores. The comic book shop and direct market is going through, once again, growing pains. But I find it ironic that some of the same arguments that the comics gate cult are waging now were being said back in 92. It's kind of, they've been predicting the demise of comics for a long time, and it's peaks and valleys. But like Mark Twain said, the reports of my demise are greatly exaggerated, or words to that effect. I'm paraphrasing, but you get the gist. And Dave makes a point here that the stores that got started and flourished back in the early 80s, there were only 50 or 75 titles in the market. So he's saying instead of taking the Diamond catalog and ordering all the 500 things offered, just pick the 50 best ones. And he comments how he gets frustrated with the attitude of, I like these, but they won't sell. And he wonders what makes their taste so extraordinary that they know that if you carry the stuff they like, they'll go baroque. I don't think it's true. And people said the same thing about Cerebus, that it's too complicated, too hard to understand. But I think there were enough readers to sustain it for 300 issues. So somebody obviously was getting the gist of the book and following along with him. So I know that some people say dumb it down for your audience, but I don't know that you have to do that. Make it smart, and it's art. Um, and then he's also talking about how Marvel and DC are running out of time because they're waiting for the next Alan Moore or Frank Miller. And he makes the point of saying Alan Moore's not coming back. Frank Miller's not coming back. I wouldn't expect Neil Gaiman to stay very long after he's done with Sandman. Now, Frank has come back, left again, come back. So he's kind of got a revolving door and is always welcome no matter what he's drawing. And Neil Gaiman is working with Marvel at times on the new Miracle Man stuff. And then he's also created a new line of Sandman adjacent type books for DC. So Sim wasn't quite the augur of the future he thought he was, but Alan Moore did not come back. And he has continued to do comics, but not for DC. Not since Watchmen. He did do those ABC books for Wildstorm, and in the middle of the run, Jim Lee sold Wildstorm to DC. So in effect, he was working for DC again, but he tended to wrap up his commitments on those books and move on once again because he didn't like the association with DC Comics. So, and Sim talks about how there are people in rotation in comics. They get their month and a half, top of the heat, and they're gone. It's not like they're Neil Adams, John Byrne, or Chris Claremont, or Alan Moore. The fame doesn't sustain itself. By the time you've done 16 issues of the adjectiveless Spider-Man, that's it. Everybody's seen your bag of tricks. So you better figure out something else to do. Sales are dropping because everyone orders enormous quantities of number ones and then starts cutting. And then boom, you just become another guy on the block. And I think that happens. You know, there's artists that do great art, but it's like they kind of like lose favor, or people want something new at all points. I know that Jerry Ordway was talking about this, how he's been aged out of comics, and his stuff still looks as good as it ever did. And you know, to me, in my opinion, he's one of the best Superman artists of the last 20 years. You know, there's Wayne Boring, There's Kurt Swan, and there's Jerry Ordway. And of course, Siegel and Schuster, the originators of the whole Superman and superheroes. So I think this happens where, it's a cycle, and the new hot artists will lose favor fast and furious. Or he will be furious, I should say. And Sim talks about when they start doing die cut covers and holograms, they're really scraping the barrel. They don't know what they're doing, and they are wondering when Watchmen and Dark Knight the success of those comics will repeat itself. And it's not going to happen with dumb gimmicks. Those die cut covers, variant covers like they are now, and the holograms are really scams and the comic book equivalent of junk bonds. And any growth that you receive from them is an illusion. It's you're basically bilking kids out of their lunch money. This is not what the promise of Watchmen and Dark Knight was. And there's an article earlier in this issue where they talk about Marvel stock drops after negative coverage in Barron's. The departure of some of Marvel's hottest fan favorite artists, among others, has shaken Wall Street's faith in the House of Ideas. Marvel's stock dropped $11.375 thousand a share to $54,625 after February 17th. Barron's publisher an article questioning its growth potential and reporting the departure of such artists as Rob Liefeld, Eric Larson, and Todd McFarlane, who had left Marvel to form Image, of course. And they talk about how Barron's, there's a quote in Barron's that says, Marvel has wrung about as much of the market as possible. The growth potential in advertising and licensing is virtually exhausted. Prices have peaked. Unit growth has stalled. The universe of potential licenses has been depopulated. And all comic book companies are dependent on direct market distribution and retailers, but only Marvel is publicly traded. At least at that time. I'm not sure about nowadays. I mean, basically, what, Disney owns Marvel. I'm not sure if Warner Brothers still owns DC or whether it's been taken over by another company. I know there was some talk of that. I'm not up on the latest. So we're back to 1992. So I find that interesting. Again, this same conversation is going on today about losing revenue and the comic shops not selling enough product. There's some problems with the direct market that need to be fixed, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Sim also talks about censorship and how the CLLDF, Comic Book Legends Legal Defense Fund, I guess it is. I don't know if they kept that Legends. I've always referred to it as the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, but maybe it is CLLDF. But that they have to push stores to defend themselves. Most of the store owners just want to throw up their hands when they get busted, which makes you realize that the publishers of these books aren't going to help the stores at all. They're all too happy to take advantage of creative freedom, but try to find them when it's time to defend freedom in a court of law. He's doing an art auction at these stops on this tour for the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, and he's doing these so that they can defend obscenity charges in the United States. And he talks about how if you take a mother and a police officer in tandem, they can virtually take away anybody's civil rights. And we are one police officer and one parent away from a bust at any given point. And once again, there's an article earlier in the issue that talks about Eclipse's true crime cards being attacked in the state governments. These were a set of trading cards depicting serial killers and famous criminals. And 12 Michigan state senators offered two identically worded resolutions urging Eclipse Enterprises to cease publishing and selling its true crime series of trading cards and requesting Michigan retail stores to refuse to carry these cards. The Michigan resolution stated that this product is aimed at children at a time when trading cards are more popular than ever, and placing infamous vicious murderers such as Ted Bundy and Henry Lee Lucas on trading card racks, along with children's true heroes. I guess they're talking about baseball stars, is deplorable. There's that word. Similar bans on Eclipse cards have apparently been purchased by state legislators in Maryland and Arkansas. Meanwhile, the city of Rosemead, California, citing a recent surge of California distribution of trading cards depicting the likenesses of convicted mass murderers, has unanimously passed a resolution urging the California legislature to prohibit the production of all materials depicting the likenesses of convicted felons. And so again, there is censorship, and we all know that it's happened. Self-censorship, I know I've fallen prey to, and there were definitely a string of busts in comic shops for what they determined were pornographic images. But as R. Crumb said, it's just lines on paper, folks. And Sim ends the interview by saying, I don't want to sound like I'm totally down on Marvel. These comics have their place. We've got to go a little easy on people who are finding Marvel comics for the first time. All of us found Marvel comics for the first time. It was a real charge, certainly in my case, and also in the case of some other guys. We have to learn not to cast as many aspersions on the people who are keeping Marvel in business. It's difficult enough to find a place where comics are taken seriously. Somebody walking into a comic shop shouldn't have to defend the fact that they like Avengers West Coast or something like that. Also in this issue, there's a interview with Gerard. Or is it Gerhard? Gerhard? Gerard. I've always called him Gerhard, but enunciation is not my strong suit. English is my second language. Baby talk was my original language. So Gerhard, they're saying he'd never been interviewed before this interview. And he says he was just doing his own stuff, and he worked at the local art supply store, and he did the deliveries to Dave with the Cerebus tone, the dot screen zipatone dot pattern. And he was also best man at the wedding of Denny Sim, Dave's wife at the time's sister. So he ended up meeting them that way. And That's how he got the job doing the backgrounds for Cerebus. And he said when he started working on Cerebus with Dave, it was an entirely new thing to him. And he said when he got the pages, all the characters were fully rendered in ink. The word balloons were in place and ink. The panel borders were all there. There was a rough indication of what the background should be. And he says most of the time he can tell from the movement of the characters within a certain room that where they are. He says he actually has floor plans of the rooms, overviews, and he can just figure out where the characters are and take his sight lines from there. That's pretty elaborate. I know a lot of people do that now with certain programs where you can build a room and move around, but he was doing it in a different way back in 92. So he was definitely a pioneer of that. And we all know that it took a little time for him to work in, but his backgrounds were key to Cerebus and success and just how great it looks. So now let's move on. We've got a little bit of time left. And if you look on the cover on the right, number 204 of Amazing Heroes, that's the final issue of Amazing Heroes. And this is our final episode of Zinc Comics Exposition miniseries. We might get back to it in the summer or spring, but for now, this is the end, and we're closing with the last issue of Amazing Heroes, which features a Paul Chadwick interview. He's the creator of Concrete. I first became aware of him when he was doing Dazzler for Marvel. He did, I don't know, 5 to 8 issues of Dazzler. And even then I think he was being inked by someone else, but I was really, I bought those issues, I remember, because I was intrigued by his artwork. And the stories weren't as great as Concrete, but it definitely showed the promise Concrete would finish up on. And they're talking about in this interview about how he doesn't produce a lot of Concrete. It's a mini series here, a short story there. I think it was a continuous book for 10 to 12 issues, but then it became more a series of 4 to 6 issue miniseries. And Chadwick admits it's an example of quality over quantity, the curse of doing a solo strip, the meager output. And he mentions Dave Sim is the exception to this rule. And he points out that Gerhard definitely helps with this, them getting the book out on time, and that's for sure. Chadwick talks about how he would love to be producing 200 pages a year, but he's beginning to realize it just isn't in him. It's hard to manage yourself, keep up your head of steam. It's not like you can sit down and say, well, I'm going to do 2 pages a day. That's not so wild a pace, and it would quickly add up to between 500 and 600 pages a year. His problem, though, he admits, is writing. He's dreadfully slow. He eats up a lot of time with research, false starts, and procrastination. I know I do that myself. More the latter. I'm quite the procrastinator. And he admits he developed Concrete for several years before publication. He says it took about 4 years from deciding he wanted to do Concrete to getting it into print. And he said that he's realized that something he came up with in his mid-20s is going to now be his life's work. I don't think he realized that when he started drawing it, but halfway in. And again, he comes back to Dave Sim. I see the dedication Dave Sim brings to his work. I guess nobody will ever match it, but that seems like the right track. Rather than flitting from one thing to another, if you're fortunate enough to have a character you can put a great variety of stories in, stick with it. That's good advice. I know I've created character after character and lost interest and moved on. I sometimes wonder maybe I should have just continued doing Andy Warlock this entire time, or even Lost Toys, my original comic book. Uh, he also talks about a concrete movie and mentions a Tim Burton's next movie is going to be Mai the Psychic Girl, and that there's a project for Michael Jackson called Midnight with a K, Midnight. Neither of those two movies neither ever came out, and neither did the Concrete movie. But he says the contracts are signed. Uh, the process had progressed enough that a script is being commissioned, the rights optioned, and that he says that in the option, effect tests are being made of concrete as to how a stone man will be achieved on the screen. So he talks about how you'd be surprised how well aware of the comics field some movie people are. They're interested in doing a film quite faithful to the spirit of the comic. He's co-writing the script, and he hopes to storyboard it and contribute conceptual art. Time will tell. Well, time did tell, and the movie never came out. Would have been a good one, I think. Concrete might have worked better in film than some of the others. But let's face it, comics are better as books. There's very few good comic book movies, despite popular belief. And then he talks about how he's getting, he didn't do any political commentary until he put out the Concrete Celebrates Earth Day book. And he says he thinks more and more people are realizing that the process that supports the civilization we've built up can't be sustained forever, and we've got to do something about it. So, again, telling words. And now, real quickly, I want to talk about an interview in the back issue of that with Martin Wagner, who did the book Hepcats. And he says that when he debuted in '89, he discovered almost immediately there was a lot of funny animal fans out there, that it's an established genre. But he also faced backlash due to his unconventional approach. And he says what makes Hepcats different from any other funny animal book is that the anthropomorphism has nothing whatsoever to do with what's going on in the book. If you bring a human in, the scenes could be still drawn as they are. But if you bring in a funny animal, people can see themselves in the character in a way they can if it's a human being. And his approach to self-publishing is damn the torpedoes. If every comic book shop dropped the book, he'd still publish it. He says that what Dave Sim and him hope to do on the next tour is that they support dedicated self-publishers, then self-publishing will keep going. There's an enormous untapped market out there that isn't being addressed. The one thing about the direct market is how insular it is. It's a little universe where Marvel says jump and everyone says how high. What's being ignored is what the real world wants. The fact that Doubleday Books can sell 200,000 copies of the cartoon History of the Universe, and yet the regular comic book edition only sells 4,000 copies, shows how out of touch the direct market is with its readership. The comic industry seems to think that Marvel is a 10,000-year empire that will continue to fill their coffers, and it's not true. The recent artist defections are a sign of the cracks in the Marvel monolith. Again, they've been talking about the demise of the comic book for quite some time, and I just don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. Peaks and valleys. Hopefully that comics continue to thrive and that there will always be a readership for them. That's all for now. And remember, you got to think Zinc.